Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hey, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Slisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, and today we're going to talk about the sign of Taurus. As we enter into the spring, we know that Taurus is hot on our heels. Taurus is a fixed earth sign. What fixed means is that the sign is immovable in some regard. That means that they tend to be sort of black and white with regard to how they approach the world. This is a very stubborn kind of sign in that regard. That's not a negative, it's just a fact of life. A Taurus tends to see the world through a black and white kind of parameter, meaning that they typically know which way they stand on most of their topics and their opinions, and once their opinions are made, they tend to stay with those opinions. That's what a fixed sign means. There are 4 fixed signs. Taurus is the fixed sign for fixed earth. Fixed earth is a sign that Taurus indicates a time when they are, as I mentioned, they're immovable, steadfast, very slow-moving, grounded in earth, and all things that are earthly by design. Now, earth as a characteristic indicates sort of things that are founded in the foundational qualities of what it means to be a character. So we find all earth signs have similar characteristics and different traits, but being a fixed sign means that they are sort of locked into this area of what we consider to be stubbornness. Now, stubbornness, as I mentioned before, is not meant to be seen as a negative. It's simply an attribute. And it can be very helpful. If you make up your mind, say you're a parent, and you make up your mind and you're a Taurus, and you will refuse to budge in that, that could be very well seen as good discipline. So it's important that we remember that we try to view these in very positive eyes. Taurus is ruled by the sign of Venus, and Venus is the planet which oversees all things luxurious and harmonious. So naturally, Tauruses are bound and love luxury, all things having to do with luxury and the finer qualities of life. So good things such as food, wine, clothes, chocolates, luxurious cars, these are all very Taurus-like qualities and Taurus-like attributes that they are very fond of. This is very much of a case where they feel comfortable within the realm of luxury. It's a very sensuous kind of time, because it's very much, it's redolent and representative of the earth. So it's that sort of a very earth-bound, primal kind of qualities. It follows Aries, which of course is very much of a different kind of sign. So the Taurus bull is much slower, and the bull is the sign, is the animal that represents the Taurus. So when we think of stubborn, we think of that bull, you know, just standing there immovable in regard to how they act and which way they're planning on going. As a result, the typical Taurus tends to be very materially oriented. Now what that means is, that doesn't mean that they're shallow, it just means that material things have great value to them, and they are very steadfast in that regard. So when you think of a bull, you think of someone that's stubborn, so obviously that's appropriate that it fits in that spot. We also think of someone who is sometimes perhaps slow or stubborn or very methodical in their approach. The Tauruses do move slowly, that's true, but when they move, they tend to move with the right decision, or at least they have the decision that they, in their mind, is right and will be immovable. Very difficult. Anybody who knows a Taurus, if you've ever gotten into a discussion with them or an argument with them or even a debate with them, you know that they are immovable with regard to how they act. They are not ones who are bound to move. They are opposite the sign of Scorpio, so a Taurus is fixed earth, Scorpio is fixed water. So it's in that regard that there are 4 fixed signs. Taurus is fixed earth, Leo is fixed fire, Scorpio is fixed water, and Aquarius is fixed air. There's one for each of the 4 elements. Taurus is the sign that rules the fixed earth, and so keep that in mind. When we think of Taurus over the course of the span of the zodiac wheel, each of us has a piece of that pie in our lives. And so this is what's important. Your sun may not be in Taurus. If your sun is in Taurus, that means you're born between April 19th and May 19th. There's a period of time, the 30 days in which you're born. If you're born in that period of time, then your sun will be in Taurus at some degree of the Taurus 30-degree slice of the pie. But each of us, regardless of our sign, has a piece of our 12 pizza pie shape, for lack of a better term, that is occupied by the sign of Taurus. The house that that sign occupies will indicate how you may perhaps be stubborn in some ways or resistant in some ways. And I'm going to go through each of the houses so you'll know what it's like. Because if you're born at a certain time, and remember the house of the chart is based on the birth time. This is incredibly important. The time of birth sets what's called as the ascendant, and the ascendant is where the sun is on the horizon at the moment of birth. You can be a Taurus and have a Gemini ascendant. You can be a Taurus and have an Aquarius ascendant. It's important to know the time of birth when doing an accurate chart reading. If you don't know that chart reading, contact me at turningofthewheel.com, write to me, email me, and I can tell you your chart coordinates exactly where they are, and you'll see how accurate it is. When we see Taurus in the first house, we see the epitome of someone who has that Taurus quality, someone who's very stubborn, someone whose total ego is wrapped up in this earth-like quality, this sort of stubbornness, this, this drive, this, not drive so much, but more of a resistance in some ways. It's that, think of the bull in the pasture, trying to pull him on a chain, and he's not moving, he's just sitting there. Or think of that famous bull from the children's story, Ferdinand the bull, sitting under the tree in the sun, sniffing the flowers. That's very much the case of what a Taurus is like. They like that slow, methodical, luxurious type of demeanor. If you've ever been involved with a Taurus and you're a fast thinker or a quick moving person, you will be frustrated by the slowness in which they move. But the slowness can be a real benefit in the long run. So Taurus in the first house, if your sun is in the first house, your whole ego is wrapped up in that kind of quality, and you're going to represent that. If your sun is in Taurus, is in the second house, this is the house that rules money, and this is where one of the key areas where Taurus does quite well. Taurus is very good with money. They tend to be very cognizant of how they spend money, and it is opposite the 8th house, so it's very important. That's the 8th house, of course. The second house is the house that Taurus is the ruler of, and it's opposite the 8th house, which is the house of Scorpio, which I mentioned before is the opposite of Taurus. When we see Taurus in the second house, we typically see someone who's very good with money, has a strong idea of what money has to do with, how best to use money, and is probably very cautious with regard to money, but also very wise when it comes to making investments, can be very methodical and well thought out, may very well invest in earth-like qualities, such as construction or building industries, or things that are sort of foundational with regard to the way the earth moves, if you understand my drift on that. When we move on and we see Taurus in the third house is the house of communication. When we see Taurus in the third house, we might see the sun in the third house. We might see a person who has a ability to communicate, yes, but their communications are very much dictated by their own particular agenda from which they will not move. This might be someone who is very, adamant in their structure, someone who is firm and stubborn and immovable with regard to how they communicate. This may be, sometimes you might find a politician who's there who's got very strong opinions and refuses to move, but the fact that it's in the third house means that they can communicate. Third house is all about communications, radio, television, broadcasting, teaching. If you find a Taurus sun there, you're going to find someone who is very immovable with regard to how they communicate. Next, we move on to the fourth house. The fourth house is the house of family. And this is a place where you'd expect Taurus to do very well because they like to lounge around the house and they like to be comfortable. And they do. When they are in this spot, you will find a very strong, nurturing parent, one who is stringent with regard to how they, and diplomatic, and I should say dictatorial as well as diplomatic, because they will be the ones that will hold firm their views on where discipline may work and how the house should be operated, and the house may very well be, very well grounded with regard to all things having to do with gardens, shrubbery, the way the house looks, the whole appeal of the way the house looks and the way the family operates will have all of those Taurus characteristics that I mentioned earlier. The next house is the house of the fifth house, which is the house of creativity and children. When we see Taurus in the fifth house, the sun in Taurus in the fifth house, we see a very creative person. We see a person who may be a potter. So there again, we have that earth quality. The earth working with the hands in the pottery. And also someone who may do very well working with children or who has a lot of children. This is where we see this happen almost invariably. And if you know someone who has a sun in the fifth house in Taurus, you may very well find someone who has this quality, who may be a builder, who's creative, who may be a painter, who's creative, but using earth tones. And the sort of the colors that you see here are very representative of that earth-like quality that you see with a Taurus. Next, we move to the 6th house. The 6th house is the house of service and your daily work. When we see Taurus in the 6th house, we see somebody who may very well work in the healthcare industry, who may very well be of service to others, someone who may find themselves very likely to be, perhaps a chef or something like that, someone who wants to prepare but also likes to serve others. When I say serve, it doesn't mean that you're a waitress or a waiter. Serve is more about helping others. This is where we find healthcare workers, dentists, doctors, lawyers are all servants because they are there to help others. When we find someone with Taurus in the 6th house, we would see somebody who has an ability to be very refined with how they work and sort of very methodical. This is their daily work. We might see construction workers here. We might see people who work with, again, with clay or who works in the building industry, digging foundations and working with earth, or a farmer perhaps might be in the 6th house as well. So it's very important to understand that. When we consider the Taurus in the 7th house, the 7th house is the house of relationships. When we talk about relationships, this is the house where much of the activity of the individual, especially with Sun in Taurus, is dictated by how they interact with others. And this is an important component because many times people, it's no small mistake or no small coincidence that the 7th house is directly opposite the 1st house. The 1st house is the ego, the 2nd house is the relationship. Those two have to work together. Oftentimes we find in astrology, we see opposite signs attracting to each other because they have that ability where one sign fills in for the other that the other doesn't have. So there's that what's called complementary component where the two signs actually fit together quite well. Getting back to the 7th house, when we see Taurus in the 7th house, the Sun in Taurus in the 7th house, or any planets for that matter, you're going to see an emphasis on the relationship, and this may be how they relate. A Taurus person who has a Sun in the 7th house may relate in a very sort of, as I mentioned earlier, a black and white kind of format where we have this quality of yes, it's this way or it's that way. There's very little room for opinions, so to speak. Our opinions that are there are very strongly expressed. This is what's most important. The opinions are there, they are expressed, and they are adhered to. One thing a Taurus does better than anything is it sticks by its guns. So if you get an opinion from a Taurus, it's very likely that they're unlikely to change their opinion. This is very important. And when I mentioned some of the famous people, you'll be able to see those characteristics come through, especially some of the more famous ones. The next house we move to is the 8th house, which is the house of spirituality. It's the house of elders. It's the house of outside industries. It's the house of organizations. It's the house of outside resources, meaning outside money, meaning money from other sources. So if we found somebody with a Taurus in 8th house, we might find a very spiritually inclined person, a person who works for a large organization. This is the house that's actually ruled by Scorpio, the opposite of Taurus. So there's a real natural symbiotic relationship between the Taurus and the Scorpio, even though when Taurus is in the house that Scorpio rules, it takes on some of those characteristics. And this is where the nuances of the astrology chart become very clear, and it requires the individual, an astrologer, someone who understands the nuances and how to interpret this, that you get the real flavor and your eyeballs begin to light up when you see, wow, that's very accurate. I've been down this road many times with many clients, and I can see that when I start mentioning these characteristics, they say, wow, that is exactly right. And this is how astrology works. It's fascinating in that regard. When we see Taurus in the 8th house, this might be a place where we find Taurus working within a large organization or perhaps being an investment banker because it deals with outside money. The Taurus, in this case, being the hedge fund manager or the monetary manager, may be the kind of person who deals with somebody else's money. Again, I mentioned outside resources. You may also find a Taurus here who has the ability to be very spiritual. They may be someone who is in the spiritual capacity, someone who works as a spiritual leader, perhaps a minister or a nun or a priest or some sort of religious character. There's a really strong component there. Or also does very well in large organizations. So large organizations, outside resources, elderly, so people who work who have a Sun in the 8th house may very well work for the hospice people or assisted living organizations or nursing homes because there's that quality. That is also similar to the 6th house, as I mentioned earlier, where we have the people who are working for others. But when we see the 8th house, the emphasis is more on The spiritual side, it's more on the element that has to deal with, you know, sort of this greater realm, the spiritual, strong religious component, the elders component, so sort of deferring to being a mentor or someone who's very religiously inclined, who thinks big topics. Also, people who do very well in large organizations are in the 8th house as well. But most especially, I would think perhaps you'd find good place for hedge fund managers because they're dealing with outside resources. Again, there's that component. The next house we're looking at will be the 9th house, which is the house of education, and it's the house of travel. So this is a very interesting spot. This is a spot that's typically ruled by Sagittarius, who loves to travel. But in this case, when we find the Taurus sun in the 9th house, we see somebody who may be a teacher. And somebody who's a teacher is probably a very strict teacher, someone who runs a tight ship, so to speak, or loves to travel, or is involved in the travel industry in some regard, or is involved with something having to do with the earth and travel. What does that look like? What does earth and travel have to do with? How does that work? This is a very curious part of the chart because it deals with the outside elements of research and dealing with learning and so either learning or teaching. So a person with a 9th house Taurus sun might be a very strong teacher or a very strong student, someone who goes on to get a PhD, someone who's driven by their ability to learn and to absorb. Very critical component of what that's all about. What we want to see with this kind of a sign and Taurus in the 9th house is that ability to sort of be the vessel of knowledge. I guess that's a good way of saying it, the vessel of knowledge. Either receiving knowledge via the terms of the student or dispensing knowledge via the terms of the teacher. This is where we find the scholars. This is where we find the teachers. This is where we find the great travelers. This is where we find, you know, people who have taken great journeys and who have that strong earthbound discovery kind of person may be where we'd find the Taurus in the 9th house. But typically we'd find someone who's very good as an instructor, and that instructor would be someone who'd have other components, obviously, but having the sun in the 9th house would indicate a strong educational or research component. We'd find that to be very much the case. The next house we go to is the 10th house. The 10th house is the house of career. Someone with a sun in Taurus in the 10th house is someone who's going to be working in all of the aforementioned kind of industries. Construction, farming, anything that's earthbound, something that has to do with stability. This is a place where where we find stability. They may be very loyal, dependable employees, but they may also be very slow workers. That is not a negative. It should be regarded as someone who's incredibly dependable and gets the job done because they take their time doing it. This is not someone that rushes through their job. This is not someone who is charging off and rushing to get things done. This is someone who is very slow and methodical. Now, what you'll find with a Taurus in the 10th house, especially if you have an employee there or you are a person there, you will find a person who's very good with ideas, works well typically with getting jobs done, as long as those tasks are well defined and they can work comfortably within that. So again, you'd find people dealing with earthbound qualities, such as building and construction, lumber, clay, pottery, farming, all of those things which are very much rooted in the earth. Perhaps an arborist, a tree surgeon. Again, it's that earth component. Then when you take the Taurus, I have a landscaper who is a Taurus and he is mowing my lawn. So there's a good example. It's someone who deals with the earth. They are comfortable in that earth component. Farmers are a very good spot to find. You might also find that there. So again, the 10th house is the house of career, and that is where we find a person, if they had a Taurus sun in that part of their chart, they would be very strongly regarded with how they get their work done. And again, I said they are very dependable, although very stubborn. Once their minds are made up, they are very unlikely to move. They are very founded and grounded and stubborn. That is one word. If you had to pick one word to apply to Taurus, well, maybe it's not fair to pick one word. Let's pick two words. We'd have to say they are stubborn and they are sensual. Now that's fair, right? That's a nice balance. Stubborn and sensual. They both begin with S. They've got alliteration, but they have both characteristics there. So this is what's important about Taurus, because we have to think of that earthbound, luxurious quality that they espouse. The next house we move to is the 11th house. And the 11th house is the house of business partnerships, friends, and collaboration. This is where we find people working together. It can be very good, and if you find a Taurus with a 11th house sun, you'll find that that Taurus is very good working with others. They are sort of a team player. They may very well be your dependable front lineman in a football game because they're rooted and they're down on the ground and they're like that big bull tackle that's out there trying to stop the other team. So they may be very good in that regard. They're very dependable in that regard, reliable. But again, there's that stubborn quality. So when working with others, their opinions may very well be brought into the conversation, but they are going to want them to be part of the situation. And it's important that they have that characteristic, because without that, they don't have the ability to move forward. So it's good to have someone there. They're good when it comes to decision making, especially in a team environment. If you are working in a team at work and you've got a Taurus on the team, don't be surprised if that person is the one whose opinions are immovable, inflexible, and will always be there for you. So it's important to know that. Finally, we come to the 12th house, which is the house of transition. And the house of transition always gets people upset when they hear about the house of transition, because it always sounds as if it's an end of something. And I do agree that the 12th house is a house of ending, because it does have that word transition in there. But transition essentially means moving from one state to another. Now, just think about that for a minute. Moving from one state to another. Does that necessarily mean moving from good to bad? Of course not. It could be moving from bad to good. We know that's the case. When I talk about the 12th house and the house of transition, I always refer to the idea of pregnancy. Because if a person is pregnant and they come to the end of a pregnancy, that is a time of transition. At the moment the child is born, that is a moment of transition. So that term transition applies to that situation. What happens at the end of a pregnancy? We all know what happens at the end of a pregnancy. A baby is born. That is a beautiful outcome, and that is a transitory type of event. So I want you to view the house of transition in the positive way, not in the negative way. That's not to say that the other is not possible. Yes, you can go from good to bad, but the opposite is equally as true. When we see Taurus in the house of transition, we might see somebody who does very well with bringing things to an end, to culmination, or initiating things. This is an area where they are very helpful. Now, when we talk about, it's in no small coincidence that the 6th house is directly across from the 12th house. 6th house was daily work. Remember I said that's the house of service? When we look at the opposite, we might see service represented as well, but in this case, it might be something like a hospice worker. There's a transition. It could also be a real estate broker, someone who brings real estate to a close. A close is a transition. A real estate action is a closing. That is a transition. A Taurus in the 12th house might make a very good person who is able to close a deal. And nothing is better in the business world than somebody who can successfully close a deal. Many times we find people in the world who are, they are unable to close. That's the whole thing. That's a very critical part. You want to get to that close. And there's that stubborn, there can be, every time you have a characteristic in astrology, regardless of where it is in the wheel, the opposite is always true and can be applied depending upon the aspects of the chart. That is key, and you cannot find that out unless you know the actual attributes and the layout of your chart, which I encourage you to get. When you know the attributes of your chart, or take a class on astrology, which I teach, turningofthewheel.com is my website. You can find out and contact me. That's where you can find out great information about your individual chart. Once you know your unique roadmap, you can understand why things happen as they do, and you can understand how best to work with your attributes to come to the greatest conclusion or get the greatest success. We all have challenges. We all have hurdles we've got to overcome. This is a natural part of evolution of any human being. But when we know where we are, we know when to hold and when to fold. We know where our strengths are, where our weaknesses are. So it's very, very important that you understand the layout of your chart. It essentially is your owner's manual. Your owner's manual is critical to who you are. When you know the details of your owner's manual, you know how to best operate you. And all of your friends and lovers know how to operate you as well, which is very handy because they can get you. And I think there's a great deal of, on a very philosophic level, there's a great quality of acceptance and tolerance there. I think that's embedded in the basis of astrology. One of the things I enjoy most about astrology is that it allows us to understand other people. We may not always get along with everybody in our circle or everybody in our daily lives, but when we know that they are a certain type of person, we can therefore say, okay, this person is this way, this person is a Taurus, they may not move on this subject. And that's what fixed means. Taurus, again, is a fixed earth sign, meaning that it does not move. It is nailed to the floor, like all the other fixed signs. And what I mean by that is that it is stubborn, it is immovable, which can be a wonderfully beautiful attribute if you think about it. It's one that allows a person to make up their mind and stick with it. This is not someone who vacillates or varies or changes their mind. They know what they want, they know where they're going, they are going to get it done, and they are very difficult to persuade differently. So that's the important thing. Getting back to the house of transition again, think of somebody who is in the business of closing deals, a lawyer who comes in and closes deals, a pinch hitter who comes in at the end, or a relief pitcher, someone who closes. You know, that's the kind of thing we want to see. Someone who's good in that process of bringing things to the end. Also, they can be very helpful when it comes to starting things. That's another story altogether. Now, I want to get to some of the famous people so that you know and you can get a framework for who these Taurus people may be. There's any number of them that you're going to recognize. Number one, first person that jumps out, probably everybody knows, probably the most infamous person in the world is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was a Taurus, and we know how he was when he was on stage. He was a commanding person, and he was immovable until he eventually was brought down. Very interesting case. Another person that's famous in this area is Salvador Dali, the great, wonderful painter who used to draw all those earth images into his paintings. Sigmund Freud, the great and wonderful Sigmund Freud, the very first psychologist who tied everything back to the body and the birth, very much of the case. Queen Elizabeth of England is a Taurus, ironically. She seems to be the grande dame of England and does very well with regard to sort of towing the line for all good old Rule Britannia, so to speak. George Clooney, ironically, is a Taurus. When we think of people who are actors and we see the way that they carry, and you can almost see the structure in their face, they have this sort of bull-like quality. Adele. Everybody knows Adele. She's a Taurus. She has that very much, she looks like a Taurus. She has that sort of lush, somewhat full-figured body, and that's not a negative comment, it's just the way she is. She has that Taurus demeanor and stance about her. James Brown. Remember James Brown? Get on up, get on up. James Brown, a Taurus, rooted in the earth, rooted in the dance, that wonderful passion, that deep driving sensuality that he brought to the world so very clearly. William Shakespeare was a Taurus, strong Taurus, had this quality about him, which we see through the years, is just amazing. Al Pacino was another famous Taurus. So is Vladimir Lenin, the famous Russian dictator. Lenin. This is someone who is very important. And another person we haven't mentioned is Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook fame. Mark Zuckerberg is also a Taurus and has those same kind of characteristics. Now, when we look at these people, and those names are important, if you go look at some of their life stories and you research them and you understand who they are, you will come to terms with what a Taurus is like. These people are the epitome of what a Taurus is like. Now, each of their sons may be in a different house, as I mentioned earlier. When I went around the wheel of the house, they may be different, but still the same, they are there. TurningOfTheWheel.com, come and see me.